Should the studios really listen to the fans? Just a question that I want to bring to you guys, and let's elaborate. Next up, just to talk with your boy Nove 718. Let's get into this shit. I was thinking, everybody want to talk about listen to the fans this, listen to the fans that. You know my stance on that. I think it's easy to say fans when half the time you are bitching about shit you don't like. So how could you exactly be a fan? At what point you have no longer been a fan any longer, and now at this point, because you're still watching what's going on just to complain, now you're a hater. Would you not be? That being said, the fans again. First, you gotta isolate what the fuck you mean by the fans, because a fan can like and dislike what you do. So if a fan can both like and dislike what you do, how do you discern from the two? Especially if you're gonna unequivocally say, yo, listen to the fans. The fans that pay money, you and your friends, or everyone else. How do you appease everybody? Listen to the fans. Well, you know how you do that? You go through the filter that is the company, the corporate structure. Because the fans, they measure by their dollars, not by who watches the read the comic books, or the book sales, or whatever source material it comes out of. They go by the numbers that go to the theaters and try to find a way to appease all these demographics so that they can make the biggest purse. So you ask yourself again, who should they really listen to? There's a lot of ways you could go about it, because then you have to argue the question, the owner? Because if I own the property, who the fuck is you that I should listen to you? Fuck your childhood. You feel what I'm saying? It's like, it's all about where I want these characters to go, because I created them. Some people will actually disown the owners. The same people that are critical of Star Wars today, that always want to bring in George Lucas and with the highest of esteem. Where were they before, when he was actually putting out the episodes 1 to 3, and y'all was shitting on him for where he wanted those characters to go? Or rather, all the stuff that he went and retroactively did when he wanted to recut the original 3 films and add more scenes and things of that nature. You got some purists that says, well, I like the theatrical version better, which would have been the more corporate structure as opposed to the creative structure. Or rather, he only could do what he could afford to do back then. Now he wants to put things in it that he wanted to do now, but because you didn't grow up with it, you're a fan of that theatrical process that the creator that he wanted to add, you complain, bitch, and moan about, which you have every right to do. I just want to explore the idea that they have to listen to these fans. The same fans that if we was to do something different and it blows up, people would have never seen it coming, because the fans would have never overtly, prior to it coming out, accepted a Joker film. Too dark, remember that? Too dark. So if things are too dark and we give you lit up film versions of what you guys say you look for, it doesn't measure up at the box office, then at some point you have to ask the real question, were you a fan to begin with when you didn't vote with your dollars? At the end of the day, it's still a business. And you can argue against a corporate structure as much as you want to. But at the end of the day, corporate structure goes about in a very sterile manner, trying to appease the widest audience, because they want to maximize on the potential of profits that they could get. And they can only get that by diversifying their market. And not every property you can do that successfully with. So sometimes certain properties need to stay in their personal arrogance and let them be the surprise in terms of turning people over to crossover into something that they never would have overtly went for in the beginning. Now they're gravitating towards it because it's something new, it's something different, it's fresh, it changes it. It turns things upside down. It, shakes things up a bit. Shakes up the status quo a bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. But these are different type of corporate strategies that you have to know when to make those moves, when to pull the trigger on those. But to sit there and say that the corporate mandates are a bad thing, the corporate structure are the actual owners. The creatives aren't the one that have a right to do whatever they want to do unless it's bestowed upon them to do so. Then you go about the argument of whether or not is it business worthy, etc., etc. Because if you go back into a lot of creators that are getting a lot of praise now, they had ideas that readily you didn't agree with in the beginning. They wanted to kill off certain characters or do certain things to certain characters. Even though they may not have been the biggest character. There's a big big importance to the lore of the story per se, but more than likely they definitely wasn't that important to the story that they were trying to tell. That if they was to kill them off to elicit some sort of effect or plot point, the quote unquote fans would be mad about it. And there's an argument for it both kind of ways. The question is can you sell it? Is it done in a good manner? Can it be done and effective? And you have to figure out the ways in which to do it. So you put in certain barriers or certain parameters. It's a relationship nonetheless. Even though the creative can do whatever they want to do and walk away from the property, they no longer own it when they're done doing their business with the owners, making the movies. So they're no longer a part of it, and nothing's left but the brand that you left behind. They're trying to preserve the brand, preserve the characters as well. So there's certain things that they're not going to want you to do with these characters that can bruise the brand and take it someplace that will have a harder time to recover from. Or it might be some personal reasons. Either way, the corporate structure is there to make sure that they protect the brand, protect the property. And then they may even decide to do certain things with the property that purists, people who grew up and loved it, that got their hands on it as a creative involved, would say, no, I would never do that to these characters because I feel like these characters have been cemented in a certain kind of way that I interpret it. And then now we have the question, who's right or who's wrong? Now to me, I get it from a fan perspective, but at the end of the day, if you're the creative that created it, I think it's up to them to change that. Unless they sold the property off, and by then you did business and sold it off to someone else. So it's up to the owners of the property, the direction in which they would want to go to maximize on profits or appease whatever kind of motive that they have involved. I mean, it could be something less than monetary. You know what I mean? I mean, it's possible, but a corporation is going to do whatever they can to do to maximize on profits, and they have that right to. So who are we to say as fans we know what's best? That being said, there's a lot of things that fans say that I think that I wish a lot of owners would actually listen to. Not to say that we know better than you who created the character, but maybe we can give you something to keep in mind when you're deciding to do different things with the character. And I think as a creative, you should consider that, because at the end of the day, we create our projects to, yes, get some monetary advantage, but also to elicit a certain type of emotional response with the audience. Because from a very purist standpoint, you would think you created this because you wanted someone to be engaged with it. Like, I made my music because I wanted people to listen to it, to hear it. You know what I'm saying? To get a certain type of relationship with it. You know what I mean? Thus, therein, you get the comeback and you elicit a relationship, a consumer-producer relationship. You know, I produce it, you consume it, and we make that relationship work. You know, and there's a fine line between the artistry of and the business of, and the art of the business. And there's art between the balancing of the two. But that's where the corporation comes involved, because they're going to understand to a certain level what happens when you deal with certain creators that are that emotionally bound to the property, and they really have the passion to take these characters someplace else, that it bleeds through the art, it bleeds through the film, and their people actually respond to something that they never thought they would have. You know, they never thought to try this with these characters, and now they're seeing what the artists saw in these characters, and it's actually translating pretty well between the artist and the audience. And there is where the jewel is. Everybody is seeking to find that type of jewel, but you have to go through the balance. People think that the fans just know best for everything. Then why don't you go out there and make these movies, make these stories? It's easy to say that from your house, and actually the point is to actually have the conversation, actually motivate you to want to be a creative yourself, so you could create your own, as opposed to assuming that the fans should be the directors of these films that never directed anything to begin with. Now, don't get me wrong, certain ideas work, like the Sonic the Hedgehog. I have to be honest, even though if you ask me, I didn't think there was anything wrong with the original one. I understood that they were trying to go as realistic as possible, and in this sense, they should have went more with the traditional cartoony aspect, because obviously it elicited a better response. Though they probably changed nothing about the story, it was more visually appealing. They were emotionally connected to this character that didn't look so foreign. And sometimes too realistic is too realistic. You know, you gotta find the right balance with these characters and what you're trying to do. And what they were trying to do, it wouldn't have worked with that variation to get the same response. Because even though the script and the character was pretty much the same, I don't know if they changed up the voice on it just so it can match the look of the character, if it ever needed to. But if they didn't do anything else but just change the look of the character, it is what it is. And not to say that there was no other way we could have found out. When they put out, we see the response between the original and the one that came out after the modifications, and there's nothing wrong with it. And it took a purist to want to go out their way to create that variation of, because I think their art house said, hey, we could create a better looking version. You know what? They decided to go back and at the drawing board and do it. And guess what? It did successful enough that it elicited a part 2. I gotta see the first one. I haven't got a chance to watch the first one yet, but I got to. But needless to say, part 2 is coming out, and you know what? It's feeling like they're just tapping into what makes Sonic Sonic. Even though I would prefer them not being in the real world all the time, or at all, to be fair, it's working the way it needs to work for this type of budget. And they proved that's where the fans were right, but not all the time. And like I said, not all the time the creatives are always right. They try to do something a little bit too, out there, and it doesn't work for the audience. Sometimes because you're doing too much with the wrong property. Whatever kind of story you're trying to tell the property, and that story did not make a good enough marriage, or if it does, maybe it was just ahead of its time. Or perhaps even too far behind the time. But at the end of the day, the timing is also what matters as well. There's just some films that would have done better coming out a little bit later, when people were more willing to consume it. Darker films and things of that nature. Maybe, like, I think, even though you don't need to call it darker film, I would say a more serious film. Man, it still would have probably done a lot better coming out about now. Because I think people are now craving for that post the MCU. And if you would have let the MCU just run it however they wanted to, I think you would have been more inclined to see this type of property successfully work. Because now people would have been like, alright, we've seen Endgame, what else? Are you giving us more of the same? Whereas now, Magic Man is still coming out now. It would have been like, wow,